Welcome to Conversations With. Conversations With is produced by the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group, working to promote robust, effective, and responsive philanthropy and to build a network of informed, engaged, and connected funders. Visit the africagrantmakers.org website to join our mailing list.
Welcome, everyone. My name is Niamani Mutima, and welcome to the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group Conversation With series. Thank you for joining us. Today's session on COVID-19 and philanthropy's response in South Africa is the first in a three-part series exploring how the philanthropy sector has responded to the pandemic's impact for communities in Africa. Joining us today from Johannesburg, South Africa, I'm pleased to welcome Louise Driver, who's the executive coordinator of IPASA, the Independent Philanthropy Association of South Africa, Sarah Rennie, who is chair of IPASA, and Vuyiswa Sidzumo, who is the acting regional director of the Ford Foundation Office for Southern Africa. Louise, Sarah, and Vuyiswa, welcome. Sarah, why don't you kick off by giving us an overview of IPASA and how IPASA supported funders in responding to the COVID pandemic.
It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Thank you for hosting us. So IPASA stands for the Independent Philanthropy Association for South Africa. It's about 6 years old now and grew out of a more informal collection of local funders in South Africa who used to get together regularly and then decided about 6 or 7 years ago to establish a voluntary association which has a council made up of its members. We've got about 35 or so members in IPASA. They are all funders, independent. We understand independent really to mean that they are independent of government funding, so it's not foreign direct aid, and independent of kind of strong corporate social responsibility agenda. It's an independent foundation or trust, like a family foundation. IPASA is really to serve the members and to promote and extend philanthropy in South Africa. In terms of how we supported funders in responding to COVID, my personal view is that I think it was a very quick and helpful response. So, for example, I think 9 days after our president declared a state of emergency due to COVID, we had our first online meeting with all our members. So this is back in April last year. And as you can imagine, there was a lot of fear, much was unknown, but there was a great sense of urgency, and there was a great sense that philanthropy really had to play an important role in responding to something that was really quite unknown at the time. And what IPASA did was just help to convene very quickly philanthropists and connect them to experts, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic, to the medical experts or people that were working in the field of providing food or providing personal protective equipment, and help and advise the members and the broader funding community in South Africa of where one could best place funds quickly. So that was our kind of first response, immediate response. And thereafter, we convened regular online sector-specific meetings where members and other wider funders within the sector, say, for example, in education, could meet to get inputs from education experts as well as the government on what were the priorities in education and what was happening in education, because it was a changing story all the time with schools opening and closing, et cetera, et cetera. So that gives you a little bit of insight into how IPASA was supporting its members in the last year or a half or so.
Thank you, Sarah. So, Vuyiswa, you bring several perspectives to this conversation. You represent an American foundation, which is part of the funder community in South Africa, and you're also chair of the Africa Grantmakers Affinity Group, so you understand the important role that funder networks like IPASA and AGAG play. So I'm going to turn it over to you to continue the conversation. So, Vuyiswa, with that, I turn it over to you.
Thanks, Niamani, and greetings, everyone. Really excited to be part of this conversation, particularly with colleagues whom I walked the journey with last year, as we all tried to figure out how to best respond to a crisis none of us were ready for. And I think it's fair to say that, for many of us, 2020 was like a blur, and it took a lot from us all just to get through the year. And I think, as Sarah has already, been reflecting, IPASA, for many of us, played an important role, during that time, bringing funders together to find ways to respond swiftly, to the crisis. If I speak for us as Ford Foundation, we're a social justice funder. We're not a humanitarian funder. So, responding was not as swiftly as it would have been if it was something that was just up our alley and something that we were comfortable and had been doing for years. And I think the interactions at IPASA, which included bringing civil society organizations and those on the front lines to speak to groups of donors at a time, made it easy, to identify groups that were doing emergency relief and providing other services in areas where we don't traditionally work in. So for me, this highlighted the importance of philanthropy infrastructure organizations. I know that some people are quite cynical about them, but I think for me, it really drove home their importance last year. If people had not been seeing value in philanthropy infrastructure organizations, it became quite visible last year. And some of the issues for me were the solidarity and the support, which were really crucial at a time when we were all feeling vulnerable and we were challenged in ways that we never thought possible. So, Niamani, I'm grateful that AGAC has created this space for us to reflect and share our lessons, our experiences, and our stories of resilience, which I think Sarah and Louise will be able to share. And maybe with that, let me turn over to you, Sarah. I think you'll be better able to tell the stories, and you were already beginning to tell the story in your introductory remarks. So just maybe to kick us off, because I think you were already reflecting on this in terms of the sense of urgency to which IPASA responded. But based on then what you experienced and your interactions with IPASA members, how did the pandemic, in your view, affect funders? And maybe just to say a little bit more on that, maybe if you could reflect on some of the challenges operationally, programmatically, and contextually for funders during this time.
Thanks, Vuyiswa. It was a very challenging time. I'm sure all of you will know this. There were so many unknowns, and I think the immediate challenge was a sense that as local funders, we needed to respond boldly, quickly, generously, but we needed to do it intelligently. So we needed to have some knowledge very quickly. And we also had a background of, a lot of the endowments and the funding that was available really falling through the floor. So, in those first few months of last year, or mid-months, there was a 30% reduction in a number of the endowments that these foundations were holding. There was an immediate, very real practical concern about how do we up our funding, get into other areas of funding which we're not normally comfortable in, do that properly with a constrained funding environment. I think thankfully that didn't last very long, that huge funding constraint. Some of the corporate funders, I think, have felt that a lot, but not so much in the independent philanthropy side. So I think that was one of the immediate concerns for funders themselves. I think the other concern was that there was definitely a recognition that things had to happen differently. And I would say perhaps on two levels, as an example. The first level was around style of funding. So if you were used to a forward build style of funding, and used to unrestricted grants and that kind of thing, then I think the best practice advice or good practice advice was, let's connect with the partners that we're working with and not overburden them in this incredibly difficult environment with a whole lot of reporting and technical specifications and technical requirements about exactly accounting for every cent and giving them the flexibility to change their programs, et cetera, et cetera. But if your systems and processes hadn't been set up to accommodate that, I think often the desire to be nimble and quick was at odds with the way the grant-making, decision-making process happened on a quarterly basis with a pack of 120 pages and, very carefully. So I think a lot of funders found themselves wanting to change grant-making practice very quickly, being advised by, for example, IPASA, and we published some funding guidelines on how to kind of help in this situation. And I think that was definitely a challenge. But I think a lot of funders responded. They did drop a lot of their reporting requirements. They engaged very closely with the NGOs to find out what the real needs were and, do top-up granting and things like that. And then, of course, the whole online technology, not able to go to site visits, not able to actually see what's happened, I think was a big challenge as well, Vuyiswa.
Thanks, Sarah. And it's really encouraging to hear that, there was a shift in grant-making practices. Do you have a sense of whether those will be sustained, though, over time? And I know we're still in the midst of the pandemic, but do you have a sense that, people will keep doing things in a more flexible way in future now that they've seen, how to do things well?
I really hope so. And I think IPASA could play a good role at doing some, whether it's informal or more formal research, but, connecting with our members and staying, on top of that to see whether whether some of those practices play out. It's a conversation I've actually been having a lot locally at the moment with different people, and to try and summarize the ideas that seem to be in tension with each other is, this more trust-based philanthropy where the funding relationship is not about the detailed line items in a program budget, okay, versus the need and obligation to account for where money has gone and how it has been spent. And in some instances, especially where there is, say, a foundation that is attached to a bank or something that is more heavily legislated, I know personally, for example, on a foundation I sit in, there's very strict anti-money laundering and anti-terrorism requirements. So if those auditors got their way, we would literally be pinning every single invoice for a cup of coffee that our that our NGO partner was making, because they would feel satisfied that they can follow the line of funding right down to the very end, and it's absolutely clean. And how, as a community, as a collective community with our partners who are doing the work, how do we make real, we trust you, you know best, you're on the ground, you do the work, with these very real concerns around how can we account and know where and how our money has been spent and satisfy these kind of background big story regulations that are going on around, money laundering or fraud, and we know it happens. So I think that's the tension that funders face. They want to be more trusting, but then they also want to be able to say, well, this is exactly how the money was spent. And it'll be interesting, Vuyiswa, to see where the balance lies. And I think if there's innovative thinking around meeting both those needs, then we should see a great opening of more unrestricted funding and kind of backing organizations rather than just going for line item programmatic type of funding.
Thanks, Sarah. And then linked to that, I mean, and I think you touched a bit on this earlier, in terms of then, IPASA members listening to civil society and so on. So what types of requests, were funders getting from civil society during this time?
They were getting desperate requests. Let's just be honest. I mean, it was desperate. It was heartbreaking. That's an overwhelming feeling. But, I know we can get into some technical specificities here, but really, if you really want to know, I mean, it was just, hunger, food. It really was a very, very heartbreaking situation. But, from an organizational perspective, I think NGOs really struggled with connectivity, their staff and the organization as a whole. So actually just data bundles, just top up funding to get the staff workers in NGOs who were working remotely, having enough data on their phone to connect on a Zoom call, for example. Bursary students who were all sent home. How do they stay online and stay learning if they don't have Wi-Fi at home? So I think the technology challenges were huge, and that was definitely an area where you could, that was an easy win. You could just respond to that really quickly and helpfully. I think becoming compliant, so getting places open again, community centers, ECD centers, getting places where people could come and collect food or provisions or whatever they needed or learn, and having those COVID compliant required a lot of additional costs around PPEs, et cetera, sanitizing, exactly. So top up grants just to help organizations get through those. And then, as we know, and you would know more than any, Vuyiswa, the psychosocial impact on the ultimate beneficiaries, impoverished communities who were not able to work or to get their social security grants or whatever they needed. But also, the frontline workers of the NGOs who were servicing those communities were really hard hit. And we know that gender-based violence, absolutely kind of exploded in lockdown. And so I think providing additional psychosocial support was also, so there was a lot more checking in, I think, between funders and their partners, a lot more conversations about and some partners had to just completely abandon their programmatic plans because they simply couldn't implement them. And they had to have big conversations within themselves. One comes to mind, for example, that had a model that really used retired volunteers. It was a literacy model, and there were retired volunteers, work, and all of a sudden, they were not able to go into schools and not able to read with those young children. So what if you are an organization that's got your whole model set up, which simply doesn't work? How do you do that? How do you maintain that relationship with funders? Those kinds of conversations, big strategic conversations about direction, etc., also became an ask, I think, from the NGO partners.
Yeah. Just a follow-up, Sarah, because this is something really, you've raised quite a few important points. But one that resonates the most with me, because this was our experience as well, was around technology. And where you found that people were actually not asking for, I would be interested to hear from your organization firstly, and maybe for, your knowledge of what people were asking of IPASA members. It was when we were checking in as program officers, and you were asking people proactively, are you okay with data? And you would find sometimes that they still expect staff to cater for their own data. And we would say, but we've said our grant is flexible during this time. You can use our grant to buy data for staff because they need it to do their work. So what were you finding in terms of, because it looked like people, even mental wellness, at the beginning of each call, the first question we would ask is, how are you? And people would talk about the program, what they were able to do. And you drill the drum, you say, how are you? And sometimes people would then start breaking down. And, and that's when you then picked up, a lot of the strain that they were carrying. So I'm just curious, what your experience was on this.
Yeah, I mean, Vuyiswa, it really makes me reflect, and perhaps I'm going to answer your question in a slightly different way, but it makes me reflect that as awful as this last year was, and kind of we're still in it, it really revealed an opportunity for funders and NGOs to have a different kind of conversation. And I think it revealed how limited that conversation in the past had actually been, where the NGOs often expect funders simply to be interested in performance related to the grant funding that they've given. And their expectation that a funder may be interested in their own personal well-being or in how the organization is actually practically operating, whether it be technology or whatever, was almost something that I think up until this point had never been in the framework of that conversation. So to try and insert it and to say, no, we need to shift this conversation a bit. I'm interested, these are the conversations, and for the NGO to also kind of volunteer and proffer that was something new. And I think that's what you saw. And I really do hope that this more honest, interactive kind of connecting continues, because it's much more real and it's much more productive at the end of the day. You can't deliver that fantastic program and write that beautiful report if you are, a psychological mess, or if you can't get online to do, the work you need to do. And so I'm really hoping that the lack that you observed in this interaction is something that we can really start to break down and make more valid in the future.
Thanks, Sarah. I mean, really, really important. And maybe then another side of this, Louise, if I may, bring you in, is, what role then did civil society play in shaping the funders' responses, if at all, from what you saw?
Yeah, it was interesting because there was the major non-profit organizations, the key civil society role players played an immense role during last year, during the onset of COVID, because they were almost the intermediaries between the smaller non-profit organizations and the funders. And they were the ones communicating with the funders as to what the needs on the ground were, what they need to do, that they need to be more flexible. They needed to be a swifter response because they needed those funds urgently. And they also became the channel for those funds to flow to people on the ground. So we saw a real strong connection between what I want to say is the leading nonprofits in the various areas. So, for example, in food security, there was a big organization who was working with the major funders, working with the government to identify smaller food security projects on the ground and making sure the money was channeled through them, donations were channeled through them to these organizations. So we saw that these larger nonprofits were making quite an influence on the funders in terms of their response because they were working so closely with them.
Sarah was talking a lot about the issue of trust. We were talking about reporting and the relaxation of reporting and so on. And in South Africa, as we, there was the Solidarity Fund, that was set up for colleagues that are not from here, which was set up by government to, established as a way to respond to COVID-19. And a lot of corporates put their money into the Solidarity Fund, and it raised significant amounts of money. And I always wondered, how then that affected the flows of money from philanthropy, because, there was always the danger that, it would become more attractive because people would see it as a bit more responsive in terms of accountability. So in observations, how did that affect the flow of money?
It was extremely difficult. From the non-profit side, there was a huge consternation about the Solidarity Fund. Many of them felt that they weren't receiving funding directly from major funders because the funders' money was going into the Solidarity Fund. I was approached by a lot of nonprofits who were very upset about it at the time because it created another layer. Instead of the funder going directly to the other end beneficiary, it went to the Solidarity Fund and then to the next level. So from the nonprofit side, it wasn't great. From the funder side, I mean, they had excellent governance. It was a slow process. That was the only problem, because they worked very quickly to set up the fund and to get a good board and a good governance committee, etc. But the fact is, they still, because they did such thorough evaluation of the various beneficiaries, it was a slower way to get the money to those who needed it. But a few of our members did support the Solidarity Fund because of they didn't know what to support. And the Solidarity Fund, it was, for example, again, food security was outside their normal area of funding, so they didn't know which organization to fund. So it was better to fund to the Solidarity Fund, who was then concentrating on food parcels, and they knew that those food parcels would go to worthy beneficiaries. So it's a tough one, because it was a good vehicle for governance and for doing things the right way, but it was a slower vehicle because it created another intermediary to get the funds to the communities who needed them.
Thanks, Louise. And then coming back to you, Sarah, and I mean, as somebody, who's worked in philanthropy for many years, and you've been at the helm of IPASA through the years, and I know you've already started sharing some of your insights and lessons, but if you have any more insights and lessons from this experience that you could share.
Thanks, Vuyiswa. My insight, I think, is that we really have a symbiotic relationship between the NGOs that are in communities that are very quick responders to what are the real needs. And when I say communities, it's not necessarily a geographical place, but it is a place also of knowledge and experience. For example, whether it be in gender-based violence or early childhood development or health or, whatever sector. And I think, as I said earlier, the opportunity to really start having a more trusting, more open-ended conversation to unlock the creativity and innovation in that delivery sector, the NGO sector, is what I would love to see more of. And I'm not sure I know exactly how we get there, but I believe that NGOs have almost constrained themselves in some respects. And one of the key elements of that self-constraint, of that kind of being so in the trenches, being so programmatically and kind of outcomes focused, is that when these absolute unexpected events occur, to have the space to start to think creatively about how to respond to something that is completely new to everybody can be a really hard thing. And I think funders, particularly independent funders, could play such a liberating and supportive role to get those NGOs out of that kind of mentality of constraint, that out of that kind of everything is just on the breadline, and give them some more decent funding, a bit more generous funding to explore and to create. And, that is really what I would love to see coming out of this pandemic. We need to be very creative because we have no idea what problems we're going to be solving for. So we need to harness the opportunities that are already embedded in the knowledge base and in those communities and kind of promote them.
Music to my ears. And Louise, maybe let me switch over to you, because Sarah has been reflecting a lot about the role that IPASA played, in supporting philanthropy in South Africa. So do you also want to share, as somebody who's at the helm at IPASA, some of just your own reflections on the role that IPASA played in supporting the philanthropy sector in South Africa?
So it was a very interesting time for IPASA because we didn't realize what a gap there was in the philanthropy funder space in South Africa until COVID hit. And suddenly, not just our members, but the bigger philanthropy funder sector in South Africa were running around, not sure what to do. The issues were way too big for any one funder to solve. And yet they, to bring all the funders into one room, there was no convening body which was doing that. And I think IPASA was able to step into that role because we've been playing that role with our members, and we were able to step into this larger role, getting everyone who was funding in South Africa, with as many people as possible, to get together to see what are the major issues, where's the gaps, where's the overlaps, where can we connect, where can we collaborate, and really being able to connect without us having an agenda, with the IPASA being an independent organization. And so it really thrust us into a major connecting role where I think IPASA has thrived and has continued to build on is getting funders together to look at how can we solve these huge issues which are just not possible for one funder alone to do, and also just to share their knowledge and experience and lessons all the time, because things were moving so fast that the funders needed the knowledge quickly. They needed the lessons learned, the mistakes, how to do it better constantly. And we allow this by having these regular, every week we had another meeting focusing on a different sector or a different issue, but these continual meetings which allowed people to stay updated, stay connected, and really help them both in their funding decisions, but also in changing their funding practice in order to react more effectively during this period.
Well, thank you, Louise, Sarah, and Vuyiswa. Thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thanks for listening to Conversations With. We hope you enjoyed it. Please visit our website at africagrantmakers.org and join our mailing list.